Welcome, Redeemer family. If you are listening now, it's hopefully because you've listened to our sermon on Psalm chapter 35, where I had mentioned in that psalm that I was going to give a supplemental teaching that was going to talk about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in particular and how that relates to the teaching in the Old Testament. So in Psalm 35, we talked about how David is loving his enemies. But sometimes we think that that's a New Testament idea, not an Old Testament idea, which makes sense if you just read Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount by itself. It does sound like Jesus is critiquing the Old Testament, but I would like to make the case that Jesus is not critiquing the Old Testament, but he is clarifying the Old Testament. So two passages where we see Jesus sounding like he's critiquing the Old Testament are Matthew chapter 5, verses 43 to 45, which says, "You have heard it said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy,' but I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven." Now, could you name the book, the chapter, and the verse where it says, "Love your neighbor and hate your enemy"? Hopefully not, because that phrase does not exist in the Old Testament, which tells us that Jesus is not setting himself up to critique the Old Testament. He's actually critiquing a popular interpretation of the Old Testament in his own day, which took some verses in the Old Testament and used them to justify hatred for enemies. And Jesus is saying that popular teaching is false. So in that case, we can see clearly Jesus is not critiquing the Old Testament itself, but a popular teaching in his own day. Then we have Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 39. And I do think it's important that we keep this last verse that we looked at in mind, which tells us Jesus is critiquing popular teaching in his own day. But here's what Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 through 39 says. "You have heard it was said, 'Eye for eye and tooth for tooth.' But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also." Now, that phrase, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, it is in the Old Testament. But what was happening in Jesus' day, it seems, is that people were using that verse as an excuse to seek vengeance on people. And we've already seen in our sermon that actually the Old Testament says we aren't to seek vengeance on our neighbor. The reason why that verse exists, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, is because this is about court cases in ancient Israel. Because what might happen is if someone who is in poverty, if they're in court and they're being taken to court by someone who is wealthy, and let's say that poor person stole something from the wealthy person, that wealthy person might try to exact vengeance by saying, rather than giving that thing back, this person has to become my servant for life, or some way overblown punishment for the crime. And what this verse is saying is that you can't exact vengeance that way. So we might think of Lamech in the Old Testament as an example of this, where God had promised about Cain. He said, if anyone harms Cain, I'm going to harm them. But Lamech comes along and he says, look, if anyone harms me, I'm going to harm them 70 times 7. And so what the book is saying here in the Old Testament is actually saying you can't exact vengeance in that way. Justice needs to be equal. So this was a law that was meant to protect the vulnerable. It was not a law that was meant to encourage vengeance, but that's how it was being used in Jesus' own day. And so Jesus is correcting that particular teaching. Now, why is this really important? Well, it's very important because it's crucial that we see Jesus teaching with some consistency when it comes to the way we think of the Old Testament. And here's why. Back in the ancient church, there was a heresy called Gnosticism. And what Gnosticism taught was that there are two different gods in the Bible. There's God the Father, who's in the Old Testament, and there's God the Son, who's in the New Testament. And what the Son is doing is saying that old God is dead, his teachings don't matter, and I've come to replace them with new teachings. And so what we have in that model is essentially two different gods, not one God. Jesus, on the other hand, says, the will of the Father and my will are one. Jesus says in Matthew chapter 5, verse 17, I did not come to abolish the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill them. contrasts that verse with the Gospel of Thomas, which is written a few centuries after Jesus. Here's the Gospel of Thomas, saying 52. This was written by the Gnostics. His disciples said to Jesus, 24 prophets, those are the prophets who wrote the Old Testament, spoke in Israel, and they all spoke of you. But Jesus said to them, you have abandoned the living one before your eyes and spoken about the dead. So, can you hear Jesus' harsh and critical view of the Old Testament there versus Jesus' statement in Matthew chapter 5, which says, I haven't come to cancel or critique the Old Testament, but I've come to clarify it. The reason why this is so important is because the issue of Jesus' own identity is at stake. If Jesus is divine, then he wrote the Old Testament. And to say that what he says in the New Testament is a contradiction of it is actually a compromise of the doctrine of the Trinity, that God, the Father, and the Son, and the Spirit are different persons, but they're all united as one God. So it's important that we say, yes, there are some things that are new and different in light of Jesus, but that's because Jesus clarified the Old Testament. He didn't cancel it or critique it.